This morning we are starting a new sermon series for the next 6 weeks. We're going to be doing something called Hidden Figures, and as sort of a way of introduction. Kim actually talked about it a little bit in the children's sermon, but she was kind. She did not make you read the entire genealogy. She did not make you sit through that. I am less kind, so I am going to make you sit through it as we read. So this is the genealogy of Jesus as found in the book of Matthew, chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Uriah's wife, Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Abijah the father of Asa, Asa the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat the father of Jehoram, Jehoram the father of Uzziah, Uzziah the father of Jotham, Jotham the father of Ahaz, Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amon, Amon the father of Josiah, Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel the father of Abihud, Abihud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azor the father of Zadok, Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Elihud, Elihud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Mathan, Mathan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. Thank you. So, this listing at the beginning of the book of Matthew was intentional, obviously, by Matthew. It wasn't put in there by accident. Matthew's gospel is very, very focused. If you study on his gospel, it's very, very focused on proving Jesus' Jewishness to the people that he was writing to. Matthew was very concerned with the Jews, that the Jews would receive the message and that they would see Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. So the reason why he puts this listing together is because this was a fairly common thing to do in those days when you would be writing about somebody. If you wanted to prove that somebody was who you said they were, you would list this entire detailed genealogy, whether that be proving that, this king has the right to be a king, or this teacher has the right to be a teacher. This was a very common thing in ancient literature. But there's something a little bit weird in this listing that Matthew chooses to give that was uncommon from all the other ancient literature. Because Matthew's listing of Jesus' genealogy includes 5 women, which is, again, really, really bizarre. Remember, in these days, nobody really cared about women. Women didn't feature prominently in a lot of things. Women didn't have a place really in public society. They were expected to kind of be in the home and be behind the scenes. And so stopping to list women was bizarre just in and of itself. And then there's the women that he includes. There's Tamar, Rahab, Ruth. Now he doesn't mention Bathsheba by name. He calls her the wife of Uriah, but she's there. And Mary. And if you were trying to prove who Jesus was and who Jesus' genealogy was and that he really was a Jew, it's odd that you would choose some of these women because 3 of these women weren't even Jewish. So if you're trying to prove the Jewishness of Jesus, why would you give people ammunition to say, well, but this mom here way back 300-400 years ago wasn't actually Jewish? And so what we're going to do in this next 6 weeks, so we're gonna study each of these women. What we're going to try and do is think about maybe why Matthew would have chosen these 5 specific women. These 5 women who they weren't great. None of these women were queens. None of these women were daughters of powerful people. It struck me last night that, like, why wouldn't you mention Sarah, right? Like the matriarch of Jewish society, like from whom Abraham had Isaac, and there was that miracle there. Matthew didn't choose her. Matthew chooses these 5 sort of lesser known women. And so we're going to study each of these women, and then we're going to have a bonus week where we're going to learn about Mary and Martha and the place that they took in Jesus' ministry. That's what we're going to kind of dig into and try to consider what it was that Matthew might be trying to teach the Jews at the time, and therefore, by proxy, us, through these weeks. So this week, we're going to start with the first woman who's listed. Her name was Tamar. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 38. If you want to follow along in your Bibles, I'm not going to read every single verse. We're just going to kind of talk through her story a little bit and try to give you some context about who she was and what her life was like. And again, maybe we can start to understand why Matthew would have said, this is an important woman in Jesus' genealogy. This is somebody that you should know about. What can God be teaching us through here? So we start off Genesis chapter 38. We have one of the sons of Jacob named Judah. Remember, there were 12 sons that Jacob had, corresponding, of course, now with the 12 tribes of Israel. And so we have Judah. Judah is not the best person. That's putting it lightly. We've already established this. If we look in Genesis 37, in the previous chapter, we know that Judah was the leader in the plot to throw Joseph, his brother, into a pit because they were jealous of him, and to then sell him into slavery. And Judah is okay with this. Judah thinks this is a good idea. He's like, I don't care. I don't like this guy. I don't care that he's my brother. We're going to sell him into slavery. So already we sort of had this view of Judah as maybe less than what we would hope, a patriarch of the Israelites would be like. And so he's living in the land of Canaan, and he has a wife. He has 3 sons. And as sort of was the custom in those days, he seeks a wife for his oldest son. This wife, her name is Tamar. And it strikes me that maybe Judah wasn't the best father. Maybe he wasn't the best at sort of instilling proper morals into his kids. Because after we have Tamar marrying the oldest son, we have this in verse 7, but Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so put him to death. And then Judah in chapter 8 says, then Judah says to Onan, that's the second brother, he says, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. And now, I don't know about you, but to me, this starts to sound a little bit weird. Like, the brother is dead, so now the other brother has to marry the wife. That's odd. It's not something that as modern readers we probably would encounter. I know that if I die, I certainly don't expect my brother to marry Rose. But there was this tradition in ancient times called levirate marriage. And so you see what this was, if we look at the context, if we look at the historical way things just were for women back then, women had no rights. Women had no ability to own property, no ability to have jobs, no ability to work fields. A woman's existence was very much tied to a male of some sort, whether that be her father when she was growing up, her husband when they were eventually married, or a son. Because see, when the husband dies, his inheritance would go to not the woman because she can't hold it. She couldn't have possession. She couldn't have property. And so these laws were set up to actually protect widows, saying that you need a son, basically, to hold that property and make sure that the woman would be cared for. Because her father, when he died, all of his stuff would go to one of his sons. And there'd be nothing left for her. So widows in this society were in a very, very precarious and dangerous situation. And so this law that, again, sounds kind of weird to us was kind of just a way of ensuring that God, or that these widows were cared for. But if we go back to Genesis, and we really have to start wondering about how Judah had raised his son, because talking about Onan, her second husband, we have this in verse 10. We have what he did, what Onan did, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death also. Because you see, Onan decided to disobey God. Onan decided, well, any children that Tamar has aren't going to be mine anyways, so I'm not going to give her children. And so God punished him by putting him to death. And so now we have Tamar, likely fairly young. And she's promised in marriage now to the third brother, because there was a third brother. And so the third brother's not quite old enough when the second brother dies for her to enter into marriage with him. And so I found this in the New Living Translation in chapter 11. It says, "Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, 'Go back to your parents' home and remain a widow until my son Selah is old enough to marry you.' But Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his two brothers. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home." And so if we consider what Judah has done here, even though Tamar is married into his family, even though Tamar is his daughter-in-law, even though Tamar has done everything she's supposed to do by fulfilling the law, Judah says, I have no intention of caring for you. I have no intention of ensuring that the legal responsibilities that we have to you are fulfilled. Go back to your dad and let him deal with you. And so by making up his mind to deny Tamar the ability to marry his youngest son, he is condemning her to a life of poverty, to a life of hunger, to a life on the margins, to a life where she would have no agency, no advocacy of her own. Once her father died, she would have literally been destitute. And she can't marry anybody else. She has no way out of this because of the law she's promised to Shelah, and Judah is not going to allow her to fulfill that part of the law. And it's interesting that Judah looks at the two brothers dying not as an indictment of his own punishment, not as an indictment of his sons being evil in the sight of the Lord. That's not the problem. He immediately blames Tamar for what happens. Well, it must be her fault that my sons died, so I'm not giving her my third son because he might die as well. No trust in God's plan on the part of Judah. And so she goes back. What choice does she have? She has no agency in this situation. She goes back and she lives with her father-in-law, and time passes. And at first, Tamar doesn't know, probably, what Judah is up to. But as time passes, and as we know that Shelah gets old enough and would eventually be old enough to be married, still, Judah has not called her back. Judah has not come to fulfill what the law promises her. And so, folks in the village, they hear about Judah. Judah's wife, in the meantime, dies, and so he's kind of off, and he's counting his sheep. He's not a poor man. He's wealthy. He has flocks. He's got goats. He's got other things. And the people were like, hey, Tamar, your father-in-law is here in town. And facing what she's facing, Tamar makes a hard and difficult choice. She makes a choice that says, I have to do something to ensure my own survival. I have to do something that's going to move me out of this precarious position that I'm in. So what she does is she hides her face. She dresses like a prostitute. She goes down and she sees Judah, and Judah sees her, and he's like, hey, I want some of what you're selling. And he doesn't know it's her. Her face is covered. He has no idea it's his daughter-in-law. And so they're together. And after they're together, she's like, hey, how are you going to pay me? And he's like, well, I'll send you a goat at some point. That should be good payment enough. And Tamar says, well, as a promise, I want you to give me your signet ring and cord, and I want you to give me your walking stick. See, these were, the signet ring is what would have been, and basically think of it like a driver's license in a lot of ways. It would have been what Judah used to seal letters that he sent. It was proof of who he was. And so Tamar is smart here. She knows what she's after. She's after a child. And she knows that if she shows up with child with no husband, there's going to be trouble. And so shrewdly she thinks ahead, and she's like, leave these things with me and go about your business. And so it happens, and it works. Tamar gets pregnant, and word gets back to Judah that, hey, your daughter-in-law, who's, supposed to be married to your new son, she's pregnant. And your son hasn't been anywhere near her. And so Judah at this point does, I think, what a lot of people tend to do, in that when I'm breaking the law, I don't care so much. Judah doesn't care that he's broken Jewish law, that he's denied Tamar her right to have a son, to be cared for. He didn't care about any of that. But when it's bad on him, oh, he cares. He goes to where she is. He is determined to bring her out, to shame her in public, to have her punished to the fullest extent of the law that he was allowed to do, which would have been death. Because he's embarrassed. Because somehow she made him look bad. Again, ignoring the fact that he's had the power all along to restore her and to make things right. And so as he sends for her and he brings her out, and she's like, okay, but guess what? The father of my babies is the person who gave me these things. And she shows him the signet ring. And she shows him the walking stick that's his. And at this point, finally, we see Judah do something honorable. In verse 26 of chapter 38, we see Judah say this. Judah recognized them being the trinkets that she had in her possession, and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah. And so there is no punishment. She has legitimate sons. Tamar gives birth to two sons, Perez, who's mentioned in Matthew as being part of Jesus' lineage, and Zerah. And her place in the community, actually because of this, as again odd as it might sound to us, would have been elevated, because now she has two sons. God has blessed her with two sons. So she wouldn't have been looked upon in shame. And she would have been cared for and guaranteed to not have to live that life on the margins. So that's the story of Tamar. And this is a story that, I don't know about you guys, but growing up in the church, I did not hear this story a whole lot. Doesn't make for easy Sunday morning conversations. It's not something where you're going to find cute little coloring sheets on the internet.
Unfortunately. I tried.
This is a very...
It's not Veggie Tale.
Yeah, not something that Veggie Tales ever put out. But it's a very real story, and it's easy to look at Tamar and dismiss her. In fact, it's interesting to me that as I read different descriptions, different people writing about Tamar's story, that in almost every situation they call her a prostitute, when in reality she's not. If we look at her story, she acts like that one time, and it's only because she has to make this choice. She's in a desperate situation. But when we say, oh, well, she was a prostitute, then we can, in our 20th century high-mindedness, go, well, she probably deserved it. She's on the margin. We don't care. We use these labels to make her less than us. We use these labels to discount her story, push her to the side. When we're studying, walking through the book of Genesis, usually we go from chapter 37, where Joseph gets sold into slavery, and we skip to chapter 39, and we learn about how Joseph was put in charge of his new master's house. It's just what we do because this is uncomfortable. It doesn't make us happy to talk about this kind of thing. And so when we think about Matthew, why would even Matthew include this? Because the people that Matthew were writing to knew the scriptures. The people that Matthew was writing to would have known Tamar's story. And where we might be tempted to sort of hide, we don't like to talk about our crazy uncles or aunts or cousins who might have done things that don't make us or our family look good. Matthew shines a light on it. Matthew says, no, let's not forget about Tamar and what she went through. Because I think what Matthew is saying is that, look, there's a whole lot of mess and there's a whole lot of brokenness in this story. But even with that mess, even with that brokenness, God is working to bring redemption and salvation. He brings redemption of Tamar. He brings redemption to Judah. When later on in Genesis, we see Judah actually step up and volunteer to take punishment for his brothers. We know that Jesus is actually called the Lion of Judah. So through Tamar's story, we see Jesus bring redemption. We see God bring redemption, and we see him bring ultimately salvation through Jesus Christ, because she is there listed in that genealogy. 17 verses worth. And the fact is that God blessed Tamar even in her brokenness and used her to bring about his son in the physical walking form on this earth. And the fact is, he did it then and he keeps doing it today. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, Paul says this. He says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, this is not to say that God's will is when bad things happen to us. I don't think it was God's perfect will for Judah to deny Tamar her rights. I don't think it was God's perfect will for Tamar to have to trick her father-in-law into impregnating her. But what it says is that God knows these things are going to happen, and God can use these things and can work these things into his ultimate story of redemption. And it again holds true today. The world is still full of trouble. The world is still full of this same kind of mess that we see. We saw that Judah sold his brother into slavery. Human trafficking is not something that happens on distant shores in small villages. Human trafficking is something that still happens today in every major city in America. And just this week, we have another example of a pastor at a megachurch who had to resign because of an inappropriate relationship with a young woman who he conveniently left out was 12 when it happened. You see, people in power continue to abuse people who they view as less than them. People get pushed to the margins, they get lost, they get discarded. We do a really good job of making ourselves feel a little bit better and raised up so that we can sort of step over those that are a little bit maybe less than who we would want to be with. But then we remember that those people on the margins, that's where Jesus started his ministry. You see, the first night when he was a babe in a manger, it wasn't the kings and it wasn't the high council of the town that came to worship him. It was the shepherds, the lowly, outcast, stinky shepherds. And he ate with, it made the religious people mad. He ate with what? Tax collectors and sinners. He healed lepers and cripples. People who society at the time had discarded for any number of reasons, that was who Jesus went to. He said, I come to bring you guys good news. The world is messy. The world is broken. The world will give us trouble. As a matter of fact, Jesus tells us in John chapter 16, verse 33, I love the red letters. I don't know. I haven't seen the red letters of Jesus' words in a while. Probably because I read on my iPad way too much. But I like seeing the way that these stand out. And it says this, I have told you these things so that you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble. We talked about it this morning in Sunday school. Rose mentioned it. Psalms 23. We're going to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. But then Jesus continues in the second half of that verse, says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus is still bringing about God's kingdom. He is still bringing about redemption. For us in our brokenness, for this world in its brokenness, he's overcome it. The battle is won. We don't have to worry. We can be about his business, which is caring for those on the margins and knowing that God wants to use them as part of his story also. Let's pray.